So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marty West, and I serve as editor of Education Next. And on behalf of the journal, it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's event. Let me begin by thanking the Hoover Institution for letting us use this beautiful facility. Hoover played a critical role in the founding of Education Next nearly 2 decades ago, and we're grateful for their continued partnership and hospitality today. So today we have the opportunity to discuss one of the defining issues of our time, an issue that's already shaping the 2020 presidential race, and that issue, of course, is inequality. There are many ways to conceptualize and measure inequality, and plenty of debate about whether income inequality in and of itself is a problem as long as all boats are rising. But educational inequality is somehow more unifying. Because children's socioeconomic status is outside of their control, it seems more unfair. An inequality of opportunity, not results, something that runs counter to the American dream. So it's no surprise that we've heard and continue to hear politicians from across the partisan spectrum, from George W. Bush to Barack Obama, from Elizabeth Warren to Donald Trump, asserting that a child's background or zip code should not limit her educational options. If we can agree that equality of educational opportunity is important, how then are we as a nation faring on that score? And how has our success in providing all students a fair shot changed over time? Those are the questions posed by a new study published by Education Next that will serve as the point of departure for today's conversation. In that study, Eric Hanushek and his co-authors Paul Peterson, Laura Talpi, and Ludger Wussman bring together results from 98 different assessments conducted over the past 50 years to provide an unprecedented look at how educational inequality has changed over that time period. And I'm delighted that Rick has agreed to share his results with us today. As you'll soon see, those results are sobering and raise big questions, not least because this time period that Rick and his colleagues examine, of course, coincides with major efforts on the part of the federal government and states to break the link between socioeconomic status and educational success. So I'm glad that we also have with us today 2 excellent panelists who can help us make sense of those results. Isabel Sawhill from the Brookings Institution and Emma Vadehra of the Century Foundation. I'll provide more details on their biographies later in the event, but for now, let me just introduce Rick briefly. Rick is the Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I think of Rick as the godfather of the economics of education. He's the researcher who did more than anyone else, in my view, to turn that into an empirical field of study. He's published more than 200 articles and 13 books, including really path-breaking contributions in areas including teacher quality, school desegregation, the relationship between resources and student outcomes, the relationship between school quality and economic growth. And I'm thankful that he's made time to speak with us today. He's going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll turn it into a panel discussion before inviting you to ask some questions. So without further ado, Rick Hanushek.
Thank you all for coming today. What I want to do is just give a quick overview of a study that the 4 authors that have been working on actually for longer than we care to admit. It turned out to be a bigger project than we expected. But in the end, we think it gives some very important issues. It brings up some important issues. So the overview that, following on Marty, is that we think of education and have thought of education for a long time as the way to promote intergenerational mobility, that we don't want the children of poor parents to also grow up poor and to follow in their footsteps. What we have over the time is a whole series of very significant public policies designed to try to deal with achievement gaps and the fact that poor kids might come to school less prepared. We try to encourage their education. We've had, at the federal government level, Title I, Head Start, and to some extent special education is in the same category. There have been even larger programs at the state and local level, including a number of programs that have come by way of the courts on school finance and the way that we support our schools. And then we've also had, running through the whole period, a discussion of desegregation policy, starting with the 54 Brown versus Board of Education decision of the Supreme Court. What we want to ask is very simply, has it worked? Because we have been pursuing these policies consistently over this time. So let me give you the findings first. You've had your lunch already. I'll give you the findings, and then you're released to go if you want, or else we'll provide more details. The findings very simply are when we measure socioeconomic status of the families and array families by SES, the achievement gaps between people in the top 10% of the distribution and the bottom 10% of the distribution have been absolutely constant for 50 years. We can broaden that out to say, what about achievement of kids that come in the top 25% of the SES distribution versus the bottom 25%, and we get the same answer. As Marty suggested, you might ask, well, that's not so bad if everybody's doing well, if all boats have risen. But our finding is that while you can see some hints of higher achievement in basically middle school, by the time kids get to the end of high school, there has been no change in achievement for the last quarter century. And so as kids get ready to go out into careers in college, they look the same today as they did 25 years ago, so that boats haven't risen in that sense. There's some debate, and we don't actually provide detailed empirical evidence, but we think it's hard to argue that, in fact, families have gotten worse to offset these government policies, because one argument you might make is that we needed these policies in order to hold the gap constant, otherwise it would have expanded. We don't see any of that. And this leads us to a very simple conclusion. I think we have to re-examine how we deal with this extraordinarily important social issue in the future. So let me tell you quickly what we did and how we got to these conclusions. What we did was to look around for data sources that would provide consistent information about achievement over time, where you could compare people at different points in time. We found 4 different data sources that we thought were relevant for this. The first is the Long-Term National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP. And there we observe math and reading performance of kids aged 13 and 17, random samples of the US, starting with birth cohorts in 1954 and going through birth cohorts in 1999. And we have 48 observations out of that of consistent data on student performance for different birth cohorts. You can add to that what is now the current NAEP data, the main NAEP, in which that's where we get data on states, but we're just using the national average data for, again, math and reading, and we're using the grade 8 data. And there we observe 21 observations starting with the birth cohort of 1975. Now, we don't pay attention to the 4th grade scores at all that we could find, in part because that seems quite distant from where it really counts when people go out into the labor market, into college, and so forth. So we did not pay any attention to that. To this, we can add 2 different international data sources. The first is the TIMS, or Trends in Mathematics and Science Study, which has since 1995 provided consistent data on math and science performance for 8th graders. And then also the one that has gotten the most public attention recently is the PISA scores of the OECD, the Program on International Student Assessment, in which since 2000, every 3 years, we get new observations on math, science, and reading for 15-year-olds. And that gives us 17 observations. And so what do we get? What we do is, first we create, from the surveys that go along with each of these assessments, we create an index of socioeconomic status. And we do that not by looking at income, which is very badly measured first, particularly from surveys, but we look at the parental education, which is a pretty good measure of long-term permanent income of families. And secondly, we look at measures of items in the home. So on each of these surveys over time, they've asked kids, do you have a radio in your home? Originally, that's not very useful anymore for distinguishing the socioeconomic status. But over time, books in the home, how many cars do you have? How many TV sets do you have? Do you have computers? Do you have a separate place to do your own work? And we take both education and items in the home and create an index that we can then use. We do this annually, and that gives us measures of the socioeconomic status of all of the kids who took these tests. And then we just go to the test and sort of say, what's the scores of people that are at the top of this SES distribution? What are the scores of people at the bottom? And create measures of the gaps. Now, before I give you those answers, let me show you, I guess I've already said this. We take the top 10% versus the bottom 10%, the 90-10 gap, or the top 25 versus the bottom 25%, the 75-25 gap. And we have 96 observations over time for different birth cohorts, for different tests, for different subject matters. And what we're going to do is put a quadratic trend through them. We're going to allow some curvature and see what happens, but we're just going to put a trend through these after we allow for differences by which assessment we're looking at, what the subject matter is, and what the age of the students is. What do we get? Well, let me start with this is what we call unconditional achievement gaps. This is not paying attention to family background at all, but what has happened to scores over time. And what you see on the horizontal axis, and this is going to be a common way to portray this, is birth cohorts, starting in 1954 through 2001. And on the vertical axis is standard deviations difference. So the top line there shows you how the scores of the top of the 90th percentile of the overall distribution compared to the 10th percentile. And what you see is that there's been some slight narrowing of the overall distribution, paying attention, not paying attention at all to the SES of the families. So let me give you the main point, though, on SES and intergenerational mobility. The top line, is that gold or something, I guess, is the 90-10 SES gap over time, and the bottom line is the 75-25 gap based on the family background, the SES of the families. And what we do, we say that both those lines look flat. They barely move at all. There's a little bit of narrowing for the 90-10 gap at the beginning. That could even be data errors because it's really hard to identify the top 90%. You know, even if we went to income, it would be hard to identify because of truncation of data and because of just measurement error at the top of whether you get it. Let me take off the unconditional so you can see them. This is what I think the main point of the entire article is that if we look back, starting with Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty up till today, you see nothing in terms of changing the circumstances for poor kids relative to other kids in the economy. We sort of support this and corroborate this evidence by looking at two other gaps. The top line is the white-black gap in performance, and there you actually see some change. Until 25 years ago, there was a decline, which I personally attribute to desegregation policies that went from Brown versus Board of Education and then basically stopped at the end of the 80s into the 90s. We stopped any further desegregation, both because of court orders and other things. The blue line on this is the comparison. The bottom two lines are free and reduced price lunch lines. The blue one is just free lunch. And what you see is that since we can measure that, which only comes from the main NAEP data, it's been flat. Nothing has changed in terms of free lunch versus not eligible for free lunch. So we compared this, we calculated this index of SES with a principal component is the technical way we did this. But for each year and for each test, we took and basically ranked families by how much education the parents had and what the items were in the home. Individual students, for individual students. So we have the whole distribution of how SES varies across all of the representative samples. And then for each individual student, we go and get his or her score, and we calculate then what are the average scores of those in the top 10% of this SES distribution versus the bottom 10% of the SES distribution. And what we're doing is graphing those, the difference between those for this entire almost 50-year period. Yes, home items are self-reported, which we think that it's pretty easy for kids to identify whether they have a TV in the home. Books in the home might be more difficult to identify, but the questions that really count are things like computers and do you have a separate room to study. Now this is very different than the only alternative approach to doing this that we know of comes from Sean Reardon, who looked at incomes, and there they asked kids, what is your parents' income? We think that that's almost impossible. I don't think my grown kids that I just saw over the weekend, I don't think have any idea of what my income is today, let alone when they were in the 8th grade have any income. So we think that these are more accurate measures. These are kids in both traditional public schools and in charter schools and in private schools. It's a sample of the entire U.S. population. We basically say that we have this supporting evidence from other ways of looking at it, of free and reduced price lunch or black-white differences, where black-white differences aren't as meaningful today as they might have been 50 years ago. But then we get to the question, is it true that all boats have risen so that the poor kids are gaining at the same time as the rich kids or better off kids, so that everybody is better off even if there remains some gap? And here's where we get a slightly more complicated graph. If you look at the again, is that brown or gold in the center, is the comparing birth cohorts on the horizontal axis and standard deviations of performance on the vertical axis. We see that there have been gains over time in average achievement. But if we break that out, the green line shows what we find for basically 8th graders or 14-year-olds in the data. And if we look at the 17-year-olds as they're going out is the blue line. And what we see in the blue line, as kids leave school, achievement has been constant for the last quarter century. There was some growth 25 to 50 years ago, but it stopped. And so our interpretation of this is that the constant gaps are not offset by better performance, but in fact are constant gaps with constant performance. So what's changed? It's natural to say, well, achievement in some sense is families plus schools. Could it be that changes in the families are sufficient to offset our efforts in the schools so that our schools just manage to hold us constant? And so what's changed in the families? Well, you can list things that typically are identified as expanding gaps, such as the spreading out of the overall income distribution, or age of mothers that are different, or the rise in single-parent families. But that's offset by the fact that there has been a significant narrowing of education levels of parents and lower family sizes, which typically would be thought of as bad, large families. And as we see the evidence, how do you add this up? Well, maybe neutral. Some people actually added up that families have gotten better, like Greg Duncan would say that families have gotten better over time. So it doesn't look like this is the big offset. And against that, we have this whole list of school programs that have been designed explicitly to deal with achievement gaps. Brown versus the Board of Education, Title I, IDEA, Special Education, Head Start, accountability at the state level and NCLB, and just a lot of increased programs that are probably larger at the state level than at the federal level. What do we find? Constant achievement gaps. All boats have not risen by our accounting for them. It's hard, we believe, to argue that there are these negative offsets to generally positive programs aimed at narrowing gaps. And so we're left with the final word is that we think there's a need to rethink our current policies and programs. These are important issues for the country in the future, and we have to address them as opposed to just continuing what we're doing, which doesn't appear to be working. So, thank you.
So thank you, Rick, and let me now invite Belle and Emma to the stage as they're coming up. I'll briefly introduce them. Isabel Sawhill Bell is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, where she co-directs both the Budgeting for National Priorities Project and the Center on Children and Families. She launched in 2009 something called the Social Genome Project, which is an initiative that seeks to determine how increased economic opportunity, how best to increase economic opportunity for disadvantaged children. She's published a recent book from Yale University Press called The Forgotten Americans. Emma Vadehra is executive director of Next 100, a pop-up think tank, and I'm not quite sure I know what a pop-up think tank is. It means you need an endowment. So a pop-up think tank for the next generation of policy leaders that's currently housed by the Century Foundation. Prior to that role, she served as chief of staff for the U.S. Department of Education during the Obama administration, serving both under Secretary John King and Secretary Arne Duncan. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. So I'm excited to kick off a conversation. As I said, in a few moments, we will open it up to you all as well. Belle, let me start with you. So Rick's presented this data on the persistence of the achievement gap that seems quite sobering, but they also run counter to some recent work suggesting that income-related gaps in student achievement have really widened dramatically. Rick was a bit too polite to mention it, but his results do sort of paint a somewhat more optimistic picture than that of Sean Reardon. And of course, we know that there's a lot going on in terms of increased inequality in America writ large. So, is this good news or is it bad news? And what do the results imply for concerns about social mobility in the U.S.?
Okay. We run a new initiative at Brookings called the Future of the Middle Class, and we have something called Class Notes, in which we try to find the best studies every week and put them out there for our general audience to enjoy. And this study was in the last version of what we call Class Notes. So we're helping to get the word out about your findings. Is it good news or bad news? I mean, it's better than Sean Reardon's news, which was really bad, but it's not great. It's just better than what Sean was finding. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion going forward. I'm sure already is. I'm just not privy to it, about how to compare the two studies and why they are coming to somewhat different conclusions. But I think the overall message here is somewhat reinforcing, in the sense that it doesn't look like we're making a lot of progress in closing gaps. And that means that if you're worried about social mobility, intergenerational mobility in the U.S., you have to worry as well. I mean, education has always been viewed as the route to upward mobility for the less advantaged. And when it's not playing that role, I think that's an indictment of the education system itself. Now, that said, I think it's a mistake to put too much blame on schools or on education per se. There are a lot of other societal trends that have been going on that could be really moving in the opposite direction. So, like the authors of the study, I think there's sort of countervailing forces here. And Rick talked about one of them, which is the fact that we have a lot more single-parent families and a widening class gap in family structure, really widening. So he seems to have concluded, or the study seems to have concluded, that that's offset by some positive findings for the family. And I look forward to delving into that a little more deeply, because my hypothesis or priors coming into this would have been those much higher or much greater class gaps in family structure are playing a role. I mean, if you read Bob Putnam's study about our kids, and you look at the kinds of families that poor kids are being born into these days, as opposed to the kind of kids that the kind of families that wealthier kids are being born into, the differences are huge and growing. Some of it is even related to parenting styles. And some of it is related to growing income gaps, and some of it is related to where people live. I mean, we have less racial segregation in living arrangements, but we have much more class segregation. So we could have a big conversation about all of that. But maybe I should, in the interest of getting a better discussion going here, not say more for the moment.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about whether you even need to really figure out whether the countervailing forces have been, offset by school quality. What the data do tell us is that schools are not meeting the challenge that they're facing right now, right? And we need to do something about it, even if it's very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to limit my remarks here, but I very much agree with the point that the paper makes, which is, in terms of school factors, quality of teachers and teacher effectiveness, all the research has shown is what really matters, and we're not doing a good job on that front, the quality of the teacher force has been going down. I think that's pretty clear. And we know that the best teachers don't get assigned to the worst schools. It's just the opposite because of seniority rights. And so I think that is something we could conceivably do something about. But I really want to get into a discussion when we have time about this gap between the 14-year-olds and the 17-year-olds. And I want to understand better, if you're going all the way from the 1950s to the 2000s, whether the group that has dropped out of high school, which would have been a very large group back in the 1950s and 60s, and a much smaller group now, are they well represented in these tests? And I just don't, that's a more methodological or data issue that I want to know more about.
Let's come back to both of those topics,
Yeah.
both the potential for teacher quality to be part of the answer to this question of needing to try something different, and also the difference between the 14 and the 17-year-olds. But for now, let me bring Emma into the conversation. And although we didn't plan it, Robert Samuelson of the Washington Post wrote about the study this Monday. And his conclusion, based on it for policy purposes, was fairly stark. He wrote, "The national strategy of controlling the country's schools through subsidies and regulatory requirements has prevailed for half a century. It has failed. The federal government should exit the business of overseeing K-12 education. We should let states and localities see whether they can make schools work better." As someone who recently served as the chief of staff of the U.S. Department of Education, I'd love to get you to react to sort of that interpretation of the study's findings. Do they imply that the federal government has been doing too much, or that perhaps the federal government has not done enough, or that it's been doing the wrong things? How do you think about the role of the federal government with respect to this?
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. There's very little I miss about DC now that I'm back in New York, but I do miss DC in spring, so it's nice to be back. And congrats to you guys for putting this paper together. I have no doubt it took quite a while. And I was thinking when I was first reading it, I was thinking, it's just so nice when people do the work to put things like this together. I feel like in the practitioner world, you want to see the results the next year, and you're always looking for the next year. And then the policymaker world, what does NAEP say? You're on 2-year cycles. Maybe if you're lucky, you're on 4-year cycles. But to actually see a multi-decade cycle done in a rigorous way is really interesting. And so kudos to you all for doing that. With that, I think I'm going to politely challenge the premise of your question in a couple of different ways.
Good.
The first is acknowledging it is shocking if I am the optimist in any room. I just want to take a look at this data through a slightly more optimistic lens because I think it's worth doing, and I think some of it is in there already. And I think there's other critical data that's a part of the story we should be looking at as well. And the second is honestly to think about what the best use case is of studies like this and how realistic it is to look at large-scale long-term studies to evaluate any particular program or policy of any level of government, given how complicated a lot this is. So on the optimistic front, which again, I am never the optimist in the room, but I do think there's just like a few things that we need to make sure don't get lost here. Not just about the federal role, but about the feds, states, school districts, principals, teachers, and kids, and what's been going on over the past 50 years. In elementary and middle school levels, we are seeing improvements. That's not nothing. That's meaningful. And I'd note, and we can get to this when we talk more about what the policies are, federal policy has largely been focused on the elementary and middle school levels over the past 50 years, and federal funding has largely been focused at the elementary and middle school levels over the past 50 years. Federal government, alongside states and a lot of the innovative players in, say, the charter space, have been a little bit late to the high school party on both the policy side and the practice side, and I think that's an important part of this. But we are seeing some improvement. Second, on the positive side, as someone who does this work because I want to close all the achievement gaps we see, the closing gap in terms of the black-white achievement gap is also really meaningful. It is not nearly quick enough. It is incredibly troubling that it has slowed down so substantially post, as you said, probably the desegregation era, but it is meaningful and we are making progress, and we're seeing similar progress for the Latino white achievement gap as well. Third, I actually, and this is sometimes a controversial thing to say, although not here, I deeply believe that high quality assessments are a really critical measure of how kids are doing, how schools are doing, and how school systems are doing. Absolutely, and these are high quality, good assessments, no question. I also believe that I didn't go into education to close the achievement gap on the PISA, right? Education is about educational opportunity and outcomes, and I think if we look at some other outcomes that really matter, going to college and graduating from college, we once again are seeing progress. I meant to look back 50 years, I didn't, but in the past 15 years-ish, we're seeing 30% more kids going to college, and that is a more diverse set of students, more socioeconomically diverse, more racially and ethnically diverse. And at the same time, we are seeing college graduation rates increase. Overall, I think it's like 7%. It's more quick for some groups like Latino students. So certainly assessments are an important part of the picture, but I think holistically we should also be looking at some of the other outcomes we think matter when we think about how we are doing feds, states, districts, principals, teachers, and kids, and families. So that's my more positive spin. That being said, just because I can't possibly be that positive, it is obviously a total travesty that we still have a 3 to 4 year gap in terms of how our kids are doing based on socioeconomic status. And there is no question we should be doing, I believe, at every level of the system, considerably more and not at all less. The one other thing I just wanted to say as sort of a framing point is the thing that's so hard about studies like this as a policymaker is there's just so much going into them, right? Like, you listed a whole slew of policies. That was really just what the federal policies were at that level. We have 50 states as they're doing what they're doing, which is all sorts of different things, sometimes working in conjunction with, sometimes counter to whatever the federal government is doing. We have school districts, and then we have actual practice, right? We're sitting here talking about policy, but most of what is relevant as a kid and how much they're learning is at the practice level. We have 100,000 schools across America with teachers doing different things. Want to return to the teacher quality point for sure. And so it's just really hard to know, what does this say about any particular policy? To me, what it says is clearly we should be going far harder at every level of government. We can talk about high schools, which would be high on my list. We can talk about teachers, which would be high on my list. We can talk about desegregation and integration, which would be high on my list. And there's some other things as well. But that we are sort of extrapolating from some of what we are seeing in this study. It's not the precise outcome. And I think to me, actually, the most specific piece of that is the point you all made and you just picked up on, which is even as we've seen these 8 policies, we've also seen an entirely different teacher workforce in a lot of ways. I think we all believe that, /no, teachers the most important in-school factor. And so to try and evaluate the impact of that versus the impact of various other policies is challenging.
Rick, I'd love to invite you to respond to anything you just heard. Actually, initially, there's a lot packed in there.
Picking up on Emma's last point, in the current version, the published version of Education Next, which I think is sitting here, I have an article with 2 other German colleagues on teacher quality over time. And what you see is, at least as you measure teacher quality by teachers' own test scores, their ability to do math and reading, you see that it's declined. Partly it's due to the fact that all of the women in this room who decided not to be teachers but instead decided to be doctors and lawyers and other jobs has in fact had an impact on the schools. We wouldn't want to reverse that as a policy matter, but the one part that we might want to reverse is the fact that in the U.S. we woefully underpay our teachers after you take into account their own characteristics. So if I looked at a teacher with a certain set of characteristics, test scores in math and reading for the teacher and their experience levels, and compared that to what they could earn on the outside, our estimates that are displayed in this other article are that teachers in the U.S. are underpaid by 22%. And so I think we've chosen a bad equilibrium where in fact we pay little and we get little, or don't get as much as we should be getting, and that we have to change that. That's would be part of my policy prescription. I pay more attention to the performance on these achievement tests than completion of high school and college, just because what that means has changed over time. And you can see it in part, the 30% increase in college attendance and the 7% rise in college completion suggests that we're not sending the best prepared students off to college, and that to get the full advantage of this means that we have to work harder. I don't think that the data we see really is reflecting differential dropouts of students, the 14 to 17% gap that Bell mentioned. I don't think it's reflecting that, because until the last 5 or 8 years or something, high school completion was constant, and there was just absolutely no change in it. And so that's not driving these differences that we've seen over a long period of time. I think we have to pay more attention to high schools, and I definitely think we have to pay more attention to teacher quality. If we fail to do that, I don't think we're going to succeed.
Just factually on that last point, you're saying that back in the 50s and 60s, high school graduation rates were similar to what they are now, or were
I'm
5 or
saying
8 years ago?
Since 1975, they've been constant.
But actually, they've ticked up in the past decade by a good bit. But
I'm
that's
saying that they just ticked up, and we don't know what that means.
from the mid-1970s to the early 2000s, they were essentially
They were
flat.
absolutely constant over that entire period, no matter how much we said we were going to try to change that.
Okay, I'm also interested in this question that's just come up about whether it's quantity or quality, whether it's achievement or years of schooling that matter. And I totally am totally sympathetic to the idea that people are getting more years of schooling, but not necessarily learning commensurately more, and that the school system or years of achievement are not as good as what you're learning. But still, credentialism matters, and having that degree matters. So I'm kind of wondering whether when you look at the prediction of years of schooling versus test scores on future earnings, how do they stack up?
Test score, both of them would enter into a wage equation.
Right.
But test scores, I think, are the dominant factor, in my own opinion. When you compare the U.S. to almost every other country in the world, or every other developed country in the world, you see that we have higher economic returns to test scores than almost every other country in the world. In other words, we, in the labor market, pay much more to test scores than other countries of the world. Read the opposite way, it says we penalize not having performance more than every other country in the world. That if you have low achievement, you're in much worse shape in the U.S. than you are in Germany or in Greece.
Yeah. Can I ask another couple of quick questions?
Sure.
Can I just say one?
Let
Yeah,
Emma
on
jump
this
in.
subject,
I don't want to. I want to hear your further
Yeah,
line of
yeah.
questions, so please don't forget
Go
them.
ahead.
I am the absolute non-researcher on this panel, but the idea that assessment scores are more predictive of lifetime earnings than getting a 4-year bachelor's degree within the United States, I have not seen research. And in fact, there's been a spirited debate over how predictive test scores are generally, which I would suggest we probably not get into. But I think if the question is about test scores versus getting a 4-year degree is more predictive of an increase in lifetime earnings than a higher test score.
There's no doubt that on average having a 4-year degree as opposed to a high school education has been very important, and it's been important over time. When people have looked at the expanding distribution of income, what you see is that holds within schooling category. That Within the college graduates, the income distribution has expanded. Within high school graduates, the income distribution has expanded. My interpretation of that is simply that there's this wide distribution of what people actually know and their learning and their cognitive skills within each of these categories, and that the value of that is expanded. So yes, on average, people who get higher scores go to more college and they get rewarded for it. On average, people with higher cognitive achievement go to get an associate's degree and they get rewarded for it compared to a high school degree. But that the expansion of the income distribution that everybody's looked at, I think, is increased rewards that are associated with the actual skills that people have, and that the skills that people have are better measured by these cognitive achievement scores.
I had another question, which is just to make sure I understand your SES measure. I assume it's a relative measure, that you've ranked people and said they're either in the top X percentile or the bottom. So that the fact, okay, because that would make a huge difference, obviously.
Yes, it is all relative. Each year we recalculate an SES index for each of the assessments. We have within each of the assessments, like the PISA scores, we recalculate each year an SES measure that gives us relative standing, and then we get these achievement gaps.
Right, okay.
And that's because, as I said, having a radio in your home has little information today, where it had a lot more information in 1970.
One of the most interesting findings, it's buried in the appendix of the report. You can actually see over time how the number of books in the home has gone down dramatically,
I noticed
while the number of places with a computer or internet access has gone up dramatically. And so you have to take that type of drift into account by looking at it year by year.
Yeah, I actually noticed that specifically. I was just rummaging through it, and that kind of leapt out
You're
at me.
probably reading it on your Kindle.
Well, actually, no, that leads me to my next question or comment, which is, I think the most interesting thing here is the difference between the 8th grade and the high school results. And, you do see a big increase in the levels at 8th grade or age 14. So what's going on in high school? And, you make the point that, well, we haven't paid as much attention to high school as we should have. But it occurs to me that there is a whole peer culture that may have changed in ways that's really hard to measure, but could be having a big effect. And, there's the fact that there's more screen time. I don't know whether that's a plus or a minus in all of this. Could go either way. You may have a view on that, Rick, or Marty. But there's the whole notion that this younger generation is very much more involved in not necessarily listening to their parents, being more involved maybe in drugs or alcohol. I don't know which way that goes, whether we have measures of it. I mean, we have the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, which would get at some of this. What can you say about all of that, if anything?
Bill, I tend to agree with you that things have gone downhill since we were in school.
It does sound like the dinosaurs talking about the younger generation, doesn't it? No question.
So I think there are a whole bunch of complicated things that are going on in the background, but I'm not sure that they're all negative. That's what you have to believe, that they're all negative to counteract these other things. And I don't think that really is the case. I mean, I see kids that are working pretty hard in school, lots of kids. And it's not that they're completely unmotivated. I see lots of interest in computer kinds of things. Maybe not all of it's focused on learning, but it's focused on other things. And I don't have the answer to that. We don't have the micro studies that allow us to completely describe all of the background. I just find it hard to believe that having systematically much better educated parents today hasn't offset some of this in the bringing up of kids.
What makes it more complicated in the context of this question is that you're looking for something that's had an adverse impact on 17-year-olds, but not on 13 to 15-year-olds, where you do see the improvement. And so that sort of narrows the search.
Can I add one?
That's the point.
Yeah.
I have to add one thing here. We didn't think that this study of have all boats risen in the 14 to 17-year-old gap was new, because I had a debate with another economist in 1998 about exactly how to interpret the fact that 14-year-old scores for 14-year-olds had increased and 17-year-olds hadn't. So it's been around for a long time, and people have discarded some of the most simplistic notions of what it might be, but nobody has really adequately described what this difference is.
Let me then ask a follow-up question, which actually comes via someone watching via Twitter. Sandy Kress, who's well known as one of the architects of No Child Left Behind, you may not be surprised to ask, said, my question is, could the flat 17-year-old results be due to the absence of accountability in high school? So as Emma alluded to, like the accountability movement, which has really been the locus of federal attempts to improve at least these types of measures of success, has really focused on elementary and middle schools. So, is that the natural explanation? And Emma, feel free to weigh in there as well.
Well, I'll just say I agree with Sandy that accountability is extraordinarily important, and that federal accountability under NCLB, while it has all kinds of bad connotations or public statements about it, did in fact have positive impacts. And it might make a difference. We have tried to add into accountability just what Emma brought up of adding in high school graduation rates and some other measure at high school, but I don't think we've done that very successfully.
I agree. So I would say two things. I just think we should be talking about accountability as well as funding more broadly. So I don't remember the precise number, but only like 10% of Title I funding, which is the major pot we're talking about, actually flows to high schools. Mm-hmm. It's a very small amount of the federal supplemental dollars that actually go out. But I also agree on the accountability front. I also think measuring the right things and holding schools and systems accountable for them matters, and that we once again have just been behind in getting that right at the high school level. And that high school grad rates are the first step, but that as I look at what I hope states take on under ESSA, that we are seeing very slow, small pockets of, and not nearly enough of, is not stopping at high school graduation rates, what are the other experiences that matter, what are the other outcomes that matter in terms of college going, persistence, and completion. There's so much, and I actually think this gets a little bit to the question of like, what are we getting wrong? I think a lot of things, but it's, any teacher can tell you it's really hard to keep high school students engaged if school is not interesting. And what's not interesting for an 18-year-old who's been doing this for 13 years is the exact same thing they've been doing for the past 13 years. But our accountability system says that's the exact same, or did, and ESSA leaves more room, that's the exact same thing you should keep doing. So I do think one of the opportunities here is how to think about under ESSA, states can be looking far more broadly as well as more long-term in terms of the outcomes that they're looking at the high school level.
Let me ask just one more question. Oh, Belle, you want to get in?
Well, no, go ahead.
Let me ask one more question before we open up to the audience, and to take it back to teachers, which we said we wanted to return to. Rick, I was curious, you wrote at the conclusion of the article when saying this is one of the areas we should pay attention to, you wrote, while there has been ample commentary on teacher recruitment and compensation policies, few programs and policies at scale have directly focused on enhancing teacher quality, which I think might sort of sound puzzling to anyone who's watched the debate over federal education policy in particular over the past decade, where the Obama administration really did place an emphasis on improving teacher evaluations, in theory at least, you seeing evaluation results tied to personnel decisions. So help us square that circle. Like, is it that we haven't been focused on teacher quality, or that we've chosen the wrong point of entry if we're trying to change it?
So in my opinion, it's been more lip service to that in the sense that I think it's 39 or 40 states now require at a state level that teacher evaluations include some measure of student learning gains. But you don't see many places outside of Washington, D.C. and Dallas, Texas, where this information is used for personnel policies in the schools. So we have these ratings that presumably take into account student performance, but we don't use it. And so No Child Left Behind in the waiver policies of Arnie and President Obama were ones that pushed the evaluation, but they didn't push the fact that you actually pay and you use it or retain teachers on the basis of their performance. And as some of you know, if you outside of this particular study, I have been advocating for a long time actually using information about performance to provide incentives to get better teachers. And we haven't seen much of it. But when we see it, like in Washington, D.C., we see that the Washington, D.C. performance has improved as we've given large bonuses to the best teachers and we have helped the worst teachers find other jobs.
Emma, is that the same lesson you draw?
You really want us to disagree. I agree with piece of that. And I think you all even talked about this in your paper, like I fully agree that we should think about how we better compensate teachers in high-need schools and high-need subjects in particular, and there's research and common sense that tells us that. I fully agree that a well-implemented performance pay program can be a really effective way to move the needle on improving student learning. Worked on some of those in the Obama administration. I think it's incredibly hard, incredibly complex, far more easily done poorly than well, but that when done well, it is an important lever. I also think we should be having a conversation about early career teachers in particular and the compensation they receive compared to later teachers. So I agree on all of those things, and so in that way probably take some of the same lessons. But I also want to go back to what you said before, which is we should just pay teachers more across the board. Like I have to say, as someone who, as a policymaker, you know, like we all work in this space because we think schools should be engines of equality, right? That's why we're doing this. We all believe teachers are the most important in-school factor. And then we constantly tinker around the edges around this core question that research and common sense tells us, which is that increased salaries boost teacher retention, increased salaries get a different set of people into the classroom. And in our regular lives, we know salaries matter. And yet we still tinker around the edges about whether we actually need to have a serious conversation about the fact that teachers are underpaid compared to similarly situated college graduates and other professions. I don't actually think I think we know we need to fix that. I'm also a relatively new parent. I have 2-year-olds and I'm full-time working. And once again, I'm like, my kids are going to spend more time with their teachers than they're going to spend with me. Of course I want to increase teacher salaries. But we get stuck in this debate of should the feds do it, should states do it, should districts do it, should we do it here, should we do it there? Like, we just need to it's like a perfect example of more not different or more not, so like we should be having this conversation. And I think, you know, I was thinking as I was reading this in terms of this study setting the agenda, like, if we can set the agenda so all 57 presidential candidates are talking about closing the achievement gap on both sides of the aisle,
Yeah.
like would be such a win.
So Marty has inadvertently introduced controversy here because I think the West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, Colorado, Los Angeles, Oakland decisions to increase teacher salaries are entirely wrong. That in fact they are paying the same amount for the effective teachers that we really care about as the ineffective teachers. It is promoting more retention of all teachers, effective and ineffective teachers, and it'll take a long time before the pool changes, that we might get a better pool, but that also then depends upon if we can hold out that long with higher salaries and no results, whether we are then able to select better out of this pool. And I just think that I think, as I said, we've chosen a bad equilibrium, but we don't get out of that equilibrium by paying 22% more to all existing teachers, because we will get exactly the same answer that we have today for a long time into the future.
So I think it has to be both. I think we have to both pay more overall, but we have to discriminate more on terms of performance.
Precisely.
And I think we're all kind of agreeing on that. And I do think it will take a sea change, because I think right now there is a perception that it will be very hard to change, that teaching is not a lucrative profession. And those high aptitude women that we've already talked about that used to go into teaching and that are now doing other things are not going to suddenly start getting interested in teaching, because it'll take many years, if not decades, to change that perception. I would like to know more from those of you who study this, what we've learned from Teach for America or other more micro programs where we have actually tried to improve the quality of teaching. I think we know it makes a difference, right? But I think laying out that case and the data behind it could help a lot, and is badly needed at this point. At a more general level, I think your research in this area could be supplemented to good effect with some more micro studies. I mean, on this 14 versus 17 issue, we do have a few successful high school programs. When I talked to Gordon Berlin, the president of MDRC, who've evaluated small schools of choice in New York, they got tremendous improvements, and so it can be done at the high school level, but we need to understand where and how at the micro level.
That's an interesting example. You all in the study referred to the high school as a troubled institution, and that's really an institutional reform, right?
Right.
Really creating a new institutional form, much more focused, specialized, and yes, smaller schools. So having finally succeeded temporarily in provoking a slight bit of controversy on the panel, they all quickly agreed. So I'm going to turn it over to you all to see if you all can do any better. Yeah, and I believe there will be a microphone coming around. We had a couple of hands immediately in the back, so why don't we start there?
My name's Carl Polzer, and I really do work in a pop-up think tank. This little thing I started, inequalityinc.org. So I do a lot on inequality, more on the economic side. And I think I'm suspicious a little bit when you have such a constant finding of over 50 years of things not changing, when everything's changed so much, that maybe some of the reason is in the data itself and how things are being measured. For example, I'm not an education person. When you're measuring differences in economic status by how much stuff the parents have around the house, that would be a much narrower range than actual wealth inequality. And wealth inequality will translate into the ability to influence your kids' test scores more than how much stuff you have around the house. So I don't know about if that's been sub-tested. Also, you're looking at the top versus the bottom of the heap, and this is just a question. I'm kind of interested in the middle, 60-40, because the really rich people and the really poor people, it's going to be hard to beat that gap. But in the middle, there might be more opportunity. So did you guys look in the middle about any gradations, or is there any small variation in that line in the middle? And also, I think the extrapolating from a constant state that all these liberal programs didn't work. I mean, that's just like lumping everything under the sun into a big wad and saying they didn't work. Some of them might, like, I think Isabel was going in that direction. Maybe 2 or 3 of them worked, maybe 2 or 3 of them were counterproductive. So what worked and what didn't work, and maybe they can't work. maybe the socioeconomic forces are too big for them to work much, So those kinds of things. Oh, the other thing is regions. If you have regions, that you look at different regions. Also, states and localities fund most of the schools. The money is not just coming from the federal government. So if the society is more segregated by income, you're going to have more funding. So the countervailing forces, I think, are huge and underestimated. But anyhow, just some ideas. And I like the study.
I think I heard 5 questions in there, Rick. I will not hold you accountable for getting all of them.
Can I pile on, because it's very related to his question, and ask Rick to address something that I wondered about as well, which is on your vertical axes, when you have standard deviation units, and 0.1 or 0.2 standard deviations is a lot in educational terms, right? And so you look at those graphs and you see this very, very shallow U shape, but you have to remember that that axis is could be blown up, and that U would look a lot more U-ish.
Yes, you can make any flat line look curved if you look far enough. Okay, let me go through 5 questions now as I have it. The items in the home is not meant to be a clear index of wealth, but to differentiate on average who's doing better than others. And we have a representative sample of the distribution, and we know that some of the people with 2 cars have a lot more wealth and income than other people. But on average, what we're only trying to do is get the relative rankings of the top and bottom. Now, we look at the 75-25 ratios, which are actually better measured than the 90-10. The 90-10 is not all that well measured at the top, as everything at the top is not very well measured. But the 75-25 ratios we see are absolutely flat, absolutely linear. And if you look at the bottom 10% versus the middle of the distribution, or the top 10% versus the middle of the distribution, you see that those distances have remained constant. So it's not just we're looking at some sort of tails of the distribution. We're looking at a phenomenon that isn't changing the ordering very much. We are lumping together programs. The list we have are a casual, not very systematic look at programs by major size, so that our calculations that we did casually was that since 1980 we have put $500 billion in constant dollars into Title I. You would think for $500 billion we could have gotten a little blip. We put $250 billion since 1980 into Head Start, and you would think we would get a little blip if, in fact, preschool is as important as we say. Some of the programs at the state level, I think, are actually much larger than at the federal level. The federal level is only 10% of total spending on education, and it's state and localities. But as I look at that, majority of the states have now had state court rulings on finance to try to equalize finance across the rich districts versus poor districts, which I would expect to show up if in fact we're doing the right thing. So I just list them without going into the great detail, but they are things that we have to believe are big deals, because we're putting a huge amount of resources at the federal and at the state level into these programs, thinking that they're going to do something for us. We did nothing on regions and states. We can't do it for the most part, except for recently with Maine NAEP, and we lost energy. And then finally, sort of what are the size? If you look at the biggest change, little U-shaped in our things, you get about a 0.1 standard deviation change over 50 years. So divide 0.1 by 50, and you get a very different answer. Now, as I say, the thing that stands out in my mind is that at one time we had school desegregation programs, and they appeared to work because they got large differences in black-white distributions. But then we basically stopped for a variety of reasons in pursuing desegregation policies, and we have seen no continued increase.
Emma wanted to jump in.
But this, it looks like there's a 0.4 increase at age 14.
Oh, no, at age 14. And, and if you want to be optimistic and that everything is working fine, you look at eighth graders and say that, look, we're getting this great gain. You actually don't see it if, one of the things I should have mentioned, we have these 4 different assessments. Our results are not dependent upon individual assessments. You can drop any one of them and get the same answer when you do it. But you do see a difference in the PISA age 15 versus 8th grade or 14. We've lumped things together. But in the 15, you don't see any gain in the overall achievement level, but you see some decrease in gaps. So.
I just want to provide a little bit of context around some of what you said, because I think that back and forth actually made the point of just how challenging it is to draw conclusions from this. First of all, I should say, I'm just starting my pop-up think tank, so I'm going to find you and you're going to tell me what it actually means, because I really have no idea. But I actually think some of the programs you raise in a little further sort of context around them is actually really critical, because Head Start, right? We have spent a bunch of money on Head Start. Head Start still only serves 30% of eligible students. Early Head Start, which some would argue is more critical, I think they're both critical, serves something like 7%. It's less than 10% of eligible students. So if we're going to make a very small investment and then expect to not change scalable national data, that's not the lesson I'd draw. I would look at the studies of Head Start and Early Head Start themselves that are trying to evaluate those particular policies and programs and see what we can learn. And we could, I have one read of the research there, which is that those are critical policies and programs and that we should be expanding them. But I think that would be, you might have a different read, but I think that would be the way to think about those policies. And I'd say the same around sort of a set of these, which is $500 billion sounds like a really large number over 50 years. I agree. But as you said, it's 10% of funding. It's not really that targeted. Title I dollars go to like 90% of school districts in America. I would argue it should be both more substantially funded and more targeted in where it flows to make it a more substantial investment in the highest need schools and communities, but that's not what it is currently. It's actually more thinly spread than people think, and a very small part of the overall contribution. And so again, I just think like we should think about how we evaluate the specific accountability policies of NCLB, Early Head Start, desegregation. I feel like I should be saying the Century Foundation is also having a briefing today on school integration policies and what the federal government can do about them. And they're my employer, so I should say that. But start think more about what those particular policies are and how we can learn from them. And again, from my perspective, the read on a set of them is quite similar, which is that what we need to do is expand and maybe sometimes further target, but not wipe our hands because we've made a small investment or small contribution.
So I agree completely, by the way, that we have to look in more detail at the individual programs and what's happened. Head Start is, I think, small relative to the increases in early childhood that have occurred in the States. So we shouldn't say that just because there's only 800,000 kids in Head Start that's all that we've been doing. We've been expanding early childhood across the states. And every 5 years, with both Head Start and Title I, there's a new evaluation of how it's going. The new evaluation every 5 years says the program on average isn't working. We tinker with it a little bit, and we continue to the next 5 years, and we have consistent evaluations of the individual activities of Title I since 1970 and of Head Start since 75 or whenever it started. And none of them have suggested that these programs are effective. So to me, it's not that we do have to go into more detail, but we also have to pay attention to the fact that we might have defined these programs in ways that inhibit their effectiveness. I'm a big fan of early childhood education targeted for disadvantaged students, but we have put in place programs that don't seem to be capitalizing on what I think is the potential there.
Just a quick observation as we take the next question. There's a tendency, because this is a national study, to focus on federal programs, but I think you're right to say that the real, probably most substantial changes, certainly from a financial perspective, are the reforms to state school finance systems and into the early childhood space. A more recent development, the advent of much more universal approaches to early childhood. And so those are the developments that are even harder to square with the overall patterns in the study. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you guys so much for putting this together. My question, I just have only one, so sorry to disappoint you. One of the things I looked at when I saw this study that popped out to me was that because it was a straight line, one of my first questions was, what if things would have gotten worse without these programs? And do we have any evidence or any support saying that maybe these programs were effective in the sense that they didn't make the achievement gap wider? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we tried to look at that as best we could, and in a very crude way. There's no way to actually systematically do the causal analysis at the aggregate level that we're talking about. But that was why we paid a lot of attention to how families had changed, thinking of schools and families as the two offsetting things. So maybe things would have gotten worse if we hadn't put these positive school programs in. Negative family factors would have pushed these gaps wider. When we look at the evidence, it's hard for us to make the case that there have been substantial worsening of families over time, because we have these offsetting factors of, yes, more single-parent families, wider income distribution that I don't think is relevant because child poverty has been relatively constant. But age of mothers, offset by education levels and kids in the family. If I look at the only work that I could readily find that tried to add these together was Greg Duncan's analysis with others about how families had changed over time. And he would suggest that families have gotten better over time.
But we also have screens, and the broader cultural phenomena are very hard to incorporate.
We can't. The fact that kids have gotten worse since my time is hard to put into adequately characterize.
Well, one thing you could look at, though, is the increasing class segregation. I mean, since we have neighborhood schools, by and large, and because we know people are now sorting themselves by economic status much more than they did in the past, that would be going in the wrong direction if you think there are any peer effects in schools at all, which I think there are.
Well, I think we have to look at that because I'm not convinced on that. I thought the last time I saw a systematic study of the census data suggested that both racial desegregation and income desegregation in neighborhoods had declined. But
I think race has. I think income has gone in the other direction.
Okay.
Yeah,
I don't have it readily
decades,
available.
schools, and just more related schools. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Hi, my name's Leah Cruzy. I run a group called Allies for Educational Equity. You had touched a little bit on teacher quality, and Emma had mentioned wondering about changing teacher workforce over the last 30 years. As I understand it, there's a kind of a misperception among the American public around, while there's a lot of money that goes into education, and there's an understanding that teachers are not paid well, comparable to their education level, the actual dollars going to a teacher's pocket may have gone down over this time period because of a larger share needing to go into things like pension and benefits. Did you consider exploring any kind of relationship there between what is actually going into teachers' pockets over this time period and student outcomes and learning?
So this is getting off this particular study, but you're getting into things that I've thought a lot about, and that is, it is true that pensions have gone up a lot. They're irrelevant for half of the teacher working force that leaves before 5 years, but pensions have gone up a lot. Salaries have been relatively constant in dollar terms, and they've fallen back a bit from other opportunities, particularly for women whose wages have gone up relative to teachers. And I think that's a big issue. I think that we're making all kinds of mistakes. Now, going even farther off topic here, I think that teacher salaries have been artificially held low because of a refusal to pay attention to effectiveness of teachers and not to evaluate teachers. I think that there are large numbers of places in the country where people say, I'm going to raise the salaries of that turkey, and that without any relationship between salaries and performance, I think overall salaries have been artificially held down.
Just a quick question. How would raising teachers' salary raise test scores like on NAEP faster at Anacostia High School than at Langley High School?
If you raised all teacher salaries, it would have no effect on the relationship between those two high schools. If you, in fact, did what DC has done, which in fact has had very substantial increases in pay for the top teachers and going to the zero option for the bottom teachers, you can see that over a very short period of time, the scores in DC students have gone up. But it only comes, in my opinion, from changing the stock of the force, and you change it by keeping the good teachers longer with higher salaries and getting rid of the ineffective teachers quicker by either actively using information about their effectiveness or discouraging them because they're not getting paid as much.
So I think I would increase salaries more quickly at Anacostia than I would at Langley. But I would also say that the Anacostia teachers are always going to be the newer teachers to the profession, because that's how our teacher assignment policies work. And that we know when kids are graduating from college and considering different professions, they are looking at what is an entry-level salary, and that as those raise, different sets of students make different decisions. And so it's actually for the students who are always going to be getting the newest teachers to the field that bump will make the most difference, even if you went flat. Certainly, I would also want to disproportionately increase teacher salaries there. Can I just add one other thing? I don't want to go off track into Teach for America, which is a related but separate conversation. But I think it relates to what you've said, too. A lot of what TFA did, it wasn't about salaries, right? It was about prestige. TFA brought prestige to being a classroom teacher in a different sort of way. Pros to that, cons to that, but that is one thing they did, and they changed who was entering the teacher workforce in part by doing that. That is good. We also know that prestige in a profession is linked to both entry and average salaries in those professions. And then when kids are graduating, they're looking at and understanding the overall prestige of the profession they are going into. And again, I would disproportionately increase teacher salaries at high-need schools, but I just think this is a far larger and more significant challenge than that in terms of how we actually dramatically change this, because I think if that's how I believe we will close that.
So I have to have one.
We really all agree on that. Yeah.
I have to have one last statement about this. We have tried combat pay for disadvantaged schools for a long period of time, and it basically hasn't worked. And it hasn't worked because it has not been targeted at good teachers. It gets maybe some older teachers in, but not at the most effective. Dallas, Texas, which dramatically changed the way it evaluates and pays teachers, had a program for its worst schools. And in that, it paid effectiveness rated combat pay. So you looked at the effectiveness rating of the teachers in the prior year, and you got bonuses based upon going into the worst schools and being effective, and they were ranked. And what you saw is that the worst schools, it's called the ACE program in Dallas, the worst schools, in fact, jumped ahead of the next round of schools and came close to the Dallas average because they were able to attract effective teachers into the worst schools, and effective teachers paid off.
So we're almost at 1:30. I want to be respectful of people's time. I do want to give each of the panelists 30 seconds. It was going to be a minute before you went on a little rant.
You can take it out of my
offer
time.
some parting words of wisdom. Let me just say a little bit to try and capture what I think we've heard. I think we all agreed this is sort of an important basic set of facts to establish, and that it's impressive to look over this long sweep of time. I think we also heard some doubts about whether we can really use this as the basis for drawing strong conclusions about the efficacy of specific programs. And because there's this question of, how strong are the countervailing forces? What would we seen? Was everything else really been the same? And then when it comes to sort of what should we do, to some extent, this question of have specific programs worked or not is irrelevant. Schools are not accomplishing what we hoped they would do in terms of being a pathway towards, intergenerational mobility. Where I heard differences on the panel, it was between whether we should be doing different or whether we should be doing different and more of some of the same things we've been doing, perhaps with greater intensity. And so that's how I understood the conversation. Belle, can we start with you and sort of say what you took away?
Well, I think this last conversation about teachers, we sort of all agree about. It's a huge issue, and we agree we need to pay them more and we need to differentiate by performance. I think there's some good news here, and that I think in the write-up, which I think is very good, by the way. I love the fact that this study is broad, long-term. Emma, you said this at the beginning. I totally agree about that. Really nicely written up. Very clearly explained, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of great things to say about it. But there's some good news here that I think is getting a little bit buried. And the good news is that if you look at age 14 instead of at age 17, you've got this 0.4 standard deviation improvement over this 50-year period. That's not insignificant. And who knows what it's due to. It might not be even due to school factors, but it's occurred. And I think the fact that the race gap has come down is also worth celebrating. And then I do think, as I've said several times, we do need to look at this issue of the difference between the 14-year-olds and the 17-year-olds. And the thing that keeps popping into my mind is something about peer culture, plus the point that Emma, I think, made, which is that's not where our policies have been focused. And you've made that point too, Rick.
I mean, I think I go back to where I started, which is there's some good news here, and among other data we're looking at, but we obviously have a massive problem we have to change, because this is sort of our best route to improving intergenerational mobility, and that I really hope that this paper becomes the agenda setter for all the presidential candidates, and they all decide to focus on improving K-12 schools.
Hear, hear.
And higher ed, by the way.
Rick, last word.
I agree with that. I revert to being an economist and say, look, the only thing economists know about are incentives and providing incentives to get the results we want. We provide very few incentives today to use funds to increase achievement. We say that that's the purpose, and then we give out the money and we don't provide incentives for improving achievement. If you care about achievement, you have to focus on achievement.
Well, thank you all for being here. Please join me in thanking our panelists.